Nobody knew. Not the media, not the fans, not even George Harrison. In a room at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, on March 15, 1981, John Lennon wrote the words that would forever change his relationship with Paul McCartney. A letter that remained hidden for decades. An apology that should never have existed. It was a cold winter afternoon in Manhattan. The wind carried dried leaves down Fifth Avenue while John paced nervously through the elegant lobby of the plaza. He had arrived in New York secretly under the pseudonym John Winston, escaping the media harassment following the success of Double Fantasy. What nobody knew was that Paul McCartney was also in the city. Both had arrived separately, both with the same intention, both carrying the weight of 11 years of silence, resentment, and words never spoken. Destiny, or something deeper, had brought them together in a city that had witnessed their greatest triumphs and their most devastating fall. The Plaza Hotel, with its golden facades and marble columns, had been home to countless secrets. Presidents had stayed there. Movie stars had hidden scandals within its walls. But never had it harbored a secret quite like this one. In the shadows of its luxurious corridors, the two surviving members of the world's most famous band were about to confront the truth that had destroyed them. John slowly climbed the marble stairs toward Suite 507. Each step echoed through the empty hallway like a countdown to Judgment Day. In his right hand, he carried a yellowed envelope. Inside, 3 handwritten pages in blue ink. Words he had been rehearsing for months. An apology he thought impossible. The elevator had been too risky. Too many witnesses. Too many chances of being recognized. So John chose the stairs, climbing slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to change his mind with each step. But he knew he wouldn't. He had come too far, carried this burden too long. But there was something else in that letter. Something that would change everything we thought we knew about the Beatles' breakup. A secret John had kept since 1970. A truth so devastating it could rewrite music history forever. The hallway of the 5th floor stretched before him like a tunnel. Thick carpet muffled his footsteps. Expensive paintings watched him from the walls. The smell of fresh flowers from the hotel's arrangements couldn't mask the anxiety that surrounded him like a dark cloud. When John knocked on the door of room 512, his hands were trembling. On the other side, Paul McCartney waited in silence, unaware that the encounter about to happen would become the most important moment of their lives. 3 soft knocks, then silence. What happened in that room at the Plaza Hotel in New York should never have come to light. But now, after more than 4 decades, we can finally tell the true story. The story of an apology that changed everything. Paul had arrived in New York 3 days before John. Not by chance. Linda had died just 3 years earlier, and Paul carried a guilt that consumed him day and night. In their last conversations, she had whispered something he had tried to forget. "You must talk to John, before it's too late. There are things he needs to tell you." But it was too late. John had died in December 1980, and Paul thought those things had gone with him forever, until he received the call. It was a voice he hadn't heard in more than a decade. Hoarse, tired, unmistakably real. "Paul, it's me." The phone slipped from Paul's trembling hands. On the other end of the line, John Lennon waited in silence. Alive. Somewhere in New York. The call had come at 3:17 a.m. London time. Paul had been sitting in his music room at his Sussex farm, unable to sleep, as had become his habit since Linda's death. He'd been staring at an old photograph of the Beatles from 1963, when they still believed they could change the world with 3 chords and the truth. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who's part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The voice on the phone had been different, older, damaged. But underneath the years and the pain, it was still unmistakably John. That Liverpool accent that no amount of fame or fortune had ever completely erased. "I know this is impossible," John had said. "I know you think I'm dead. I know this doesn't make sense, but I need to see you. There are things I should have said before Chatton pulled that trigger." Paul had flown to New York that same night, without luggage, without a plan, only with the desperate need to understand what was happening. He'd taken his private jet, told no one where he was going, not even his children. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with family. New York in March was a melancholic city. The last vestiges of winter clung to the snow-covered streets of Central Park. Paul walked aimlessly through the Upper East Side, remembering the afternoons of 1964, when the Beatles had conquered America for the first time. John had said then that New York reminded him of Liverpool, but with more dreams. Now Paul understood what he had meant. The city had something that London had lost, an honest melancholy, a sadness that didn't apologize for existing. It was the perfect place for a conversation that should have happened 11 years ago. The streets were full of people living their lives, unaware that one of the most famous men in the world was walking among them. Paul had always envied regular people, their anonymity, the ability to walk down a street without being recognized, without carrying the weight of the world's expectations. At the Plaza Hotel, Paul occupied Suite 512. He had chosen that room specifically because it overlooked Central Park. During those 3 days of waiting, he would spend hours looking out the window, watching New Yorkers live their normal lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the heights of the city's most elegant hotel. From his window, he could see the Dakota Building, the place where John had supposedly died, where Yoko still lived, where Sean was growing up without a father the world believed was dead. The irony was suffocating. Those 3 days had been the longest of Paul's life, longer than the days after Brian Epstein's death, longer than the endless legal battles after the Beatles' breakup, longer even than the terrible days after Linda's diagnosis. How was it possible that John was alive? Why had he faked his death? And why now, after all this time, did he want to see him? The questions ate at Paul like acid. He barely slept, barely ate. The room service trays sat untouched outside his door. The Plaza staff must have thought he was ill. They couldn't have known he was dying inside, killed by hope and terror in equal measure. The answer was on its way, slowly climbing the stairs of the Plaza, with a letter in hand and the weight of truth on his shoulders. The door opened slowly. Paul first saw the round glasses, then the hair, longer and grayer than he remembered. Finally, the eyes. Those eyes that had seen too much, that had kept secrets too heavy. John Lennon stood in the doorway, thinner, older, but undoubtedly alive. "Hello, Paul." The words came out as a whisper. Paul couldn't respond, couldn't move. For 15 months, he had mourned the death of his best friend and worst enemy. He had carried the guilt of all the things he never told him, all the apologies he never offered. And now John was there, standing in front of him in a hotel room in New York, as if they had arranged to have tea. The physical changes were shocking. John had always been thin, but now he looked almost skeletal. His famous glasses sat crooked on a face that bore the lines of deep suffering. His clothes hung loose on his frame. This wasn't the John Lennon the world remembered. This was a ghost made flesh. "May I come in?" Paul stepped aside. John walked to the window, looking toward Central Park, and Paul could see he was limping slightly on his left leg. The injury from Chapman's bullets had never fully healed. "The bullets were real," John said without turning around. "Mark Chapman shot. I died for 4 minutes at Roosevelt Hospital. The doctors managed to revive me, but the world had already been informed of my death. Yoko thought it was better that way." Paul sat heavily in the armchair. "Why?" John turned toward him. In his hand was the yellowed envelope. The paper was worn from being handled too many times. The edges were soft with age and nervous touches, because I was receiving death threats every day. Because Sean needed a living father, not a dead martyr. Because I was a coward who preferred to disappear rather than face what I had done to the people I loved. The room was exactly as Paul had imagined it would be for their reunion. Elegant, neutral, a place where the past could be examined without the weight of familiar surroundings. Neither Liverpool nor London. Neither home nor exile. Just a space between worlds where truth could finally breathe. Silence filled the room like a thick fog. Outside, New York continued with its life. Cars passed down Fifth Avenue. Tourists took photos. The world kept spinning, oblivious to the fact that in that room, history was being rewritten. "This letter," John raised the envelope, "I wrote it in December 1980, the night before, before Mark Chapman appeared. I had been working on it for months, but I never had the courage to send it to you." Paul looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. The handwriting on the front was shaky, desperate. Paul McCartney, written in letters that trembled with emotion. "During these 15 months, I've lived like a ghost in Bermuda. Yoko visits me every 3 months with Sean. Officially, I'm dead. But in reality, I'm in a limbo worse than death. Because I'm alive, but I can't live. Not until I do this." John's voice carried the weight of those 15 months. The isolation, the guilt, the terrible knowledge that he had chosen the coward's way out when courage was what the world needed from him. "Bermuda," John continued, "is beautiful, peaceful. The kind of place I always thought I wanted. But peace means nothing when you don't deserve it. I've spent every day there thinking about this moment, about what I would say to you if I ever had the chance." John approached and handed the letter to Paul. Their fingers touched briefly as the envelope changed hands. It was the first physical contact they'd had in over 11 years. "Read this, and then you can decide if you want me to remain a ghost or if I deserve a second chance." Paul took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written in John's irregular handwriting, that penmanship he had seen on thousands of notes, song lyrics, and messages during the Beatles' golden years. But this handwriting was different, more careful, more deliberate. The writing of a man who knew these might be the most important words he'd ever put on paper. "What's inside?" Paul asked. John sat on the bed, his back to the window. The afternoon light of New York created deep shadows on his face, making him look like a man caught between two worlds, which Paul realized was exactly what he was. The truth about why I destroyed the Beatles, the truth about why I hated you for so long, and the truth about something I did that I should never have done. Paul slowly opened the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. The paper was expensive, hotel stationery from some place John had stayed while working on the letter. The first line hit him like a punch. "Paul, I'm sorry. For everything, but especially for the biggest lie I ever told the world." Paul read in silence for 20 minutes. With each line, his face changed. Surprise, pain, rage, understanding, and finally, something John hadn't seen in Paul's eyes since 1968. Forgiveness. The letter was devastating in its brutal honesty. John confessed that he had deliberately sabotaged the Let It Be recording sessions, that he had manipulated George and Ringo to take his side in fights, that he had leaked false information to the press about Paul to make him look like the villain of the breakup. But there was something worse. "Paul," John had written on the second page, "what hurts me most isn't having hurt you. It's having lied to the world about who you really were during those last years. I let everyone believe you were controlling, arrogant, that you wanted to be the leader of the band. The truth is that you were the only one who tried to keep us together. You were the one who still believed in us when I had already lost faith. You were the adult while I behaved like a wounded child." The handwriting became messier as the letter progressed, as if John's emotions had overwhelmed his careful penmanship. Paul could see tear stains on some of the words, making them blur slightly on the expensive hotel paper. Paul looked up from the letter. John was staring out the window, with glassy eyes that reflected the dying light of the New York afternoon. "On the third page," John said without turning around, "is the worst part." Paul continued reading. The words became harder to decipher, as if John had been crying while writing. The confessions became more personal, more devastating with each paragraph. "For years I said that you had written the commercial songs, and I the artistic ones. That you had turned the Beatles into a pop band, while I tried to maintain integrity. But the truth is that some of the songs the world believes I wrote were actually yours. In My Life was your melody. Norwegian Wood was your concept. A Day in the Life was mainly your vision. I let them think I was the genius and you were the businessman. I let them rewrite history because my ego couldn't accept that maybe, just maybe, you were better songwriter than me. Thank you." Paul dropped the letter. His hands were shaking so much he couldn't hold the paper. The pages scattered across the Persian rug like fallen leaves, each one carrying a piece of the truth that had been buried for over a decade. "John, don't say anything yet." John turned toward him. "There's more." In the Plaza Hotel room, with New York's golden light filtering through the curtains, John Lennon began to tell a story he had kept for 11 years. A story about jealousy, insecurity, and the terrible fear of being considered second best. "When we wrote Yesterday, I hated it. I hated it because I knew it was perfect and that I could never write anything like it. When you created Let It Be, I wanted to destroy it because I knew it was going to be our most important song. Every time you composed something beautiful, I responded with something more experimental, more intellectual, because I couldn't compete with your ability to touch hearts." John's voice broke slightly as he continued. "Do you remember that night in 1968 when we were working on the White Album? You played Hey Jude for the first time, and I sat there listening to this perfect song about comfort and hope. And all I could think was, I'll never write anything that pure. So I went home and wrote Revolution 9, 7 minutes of noise and chaos, just to prove I was more avant-garde than you." Paul finally spoke, his voice broken. "But your songs were incredible, John. Imagine, working class hero, jealous guy. I mean, again. Written in the years after the Beatles, when I finally stopped competing with you and started being honest." John sat in front of Paul. "During the band years, I was so terrified that the world would realize you were the true heart of the Beatles, that I dedicated all my energy to making sure that never happened." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over New York. The city lights were starting to come on, creating a golden mosaic reflected in the plaza's windows. The sounds of traffic and life continued below, oblivious to the emotional earthquake happening 5 stories above. "There's something else," John continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Yoko." Paul leaned forward, sensing that the worst revelation was yet to come. "The night before our last recording session together, before we knew it would be our last, I called a journalist from Rolling Stone. I told him that you were planning to leave the Beatles, that you had already met with lawyers about going solo. None of it was true, but I knew that once the story broke, you'd be forced to deny it. and the denial would look like an admission of guilt. The room seemed to grow smaller around them. Paul felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. You created the narrative that I was the one breaking up the band. Yes, John's voice was barely audible. I destroyed us before you could leave me. I made you the villain so I could be the victim. And then I spent 11 years convincing myself that my version of events was the truth. Why now? Paul asked. Why after all this time? John took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. The gesture made him look younger, more vulnerable. For a moment, Paul could see the scared boy from Liverpool who had lost his mother too young and never learned how to trust anyone completely. Because Sean asked me last week if his dad had been a good person, and I realized I couldn't answer that question while still carrying these lies. What followed was the most difficult conversation of their lives. Paul confronted John with 11 years of accumulated pain. The public humiliation. The interviews where John had described him as calculating and soulless. The years where Paul had been portrayed as the villain who destroyed the world's most important band. Do you know what it was like hearing "How Do You Sleep" on the radio? Paul shouted, standing up. Do you know what it was like when my own children asked me if it was true that I had ruined the Beatles? John took each word like a stab. He deserved it. He deserved that and more. Mary was 8 years old when she came home from school crying because some kid told her that her daddy had killed the best band in the world. 8 years old, John. She didn't even understand what the Beatles were. But she knew I had done something terrible, because you told the world I had. Paul's voice cracked with the memory. Those had been some of the darkest days of his life, when even his own children looked at him with confusion and disappointment. I hated you so much, Paul continued, that some nights I would stay awake imagining what it would be like if you were really dead. And when you finally died, I hated myself for ever wishing that. The words hit John like physical blows. Each accusation, each memory of pain, each moment of public humiliation that Paul had endured because of his lies. John had known intellectually that his actions had consequences, but hearing the specific details of how his betrayal had destroyed Paul's relationship with his own children was almost unbearable. Linda used to find me crying in my studio, Paul said, his voice now quiet but filled with pain. She'd ask what was wrong, and I couldn't explain it. How do you tell your wife that your best friend has convinced the world that you're a monster? How do you explain that the music that brought you together is now the thing tearing you apart? The room filled with dense silence. Outside, New York had fallen into night. The lights from cars created streaks of light that moved like tears across the walls. The city that never slept was settling into its evening rhythm, while in the Plaza Hotel, two men confronted the wreckage of their shared past. John stood up slowly and walked to the window. For several minutes, he said nothing. He just looked at the city, seeing his own reflection in the glass. A ghost of a man who had chosen cowardice over courage, lies over truth. When I was a child, he finally said, my mother abandoned me. My father abandoned me. Aunt Mimi raised me, but I always knew I wasn't her first choice. When I met the Beatles, when I met you for the first time in my life, I had a family. He turned toward Paul, and in his eyes was a vulnerability Paul hadn't seen since they were teenagers in Liverpool. Writing songs in Paul's living room while Jim McCartney made them tea and told them they sounded like stars. But families fight, families hurt each other, and when we started to succeed, when the world started paying attention to us, I was terrified that you would abandon me like everyone else had. So I decided to abandon you first. Paul felt as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for decades. Suddenly, everything was starting to make sense. The competitive interviews, the public feuds, the deliberate cruelty of songs like "How Do You Sleep?" Every time you were brilliant, every time you had an incredible idea, Every time others admired you, I interpreted it as a threat. Because in my twisted mind, if you were the best, then I wasn't necessary. And if I wasn't necessary, you would abandon me. John approached Paul, and for the first time in 11 years, he looked him directly in the eyes. The distance between them, physical and emotional, suddenly felt immense and microscopic at the same time. So I abandoned you first. I destroyed the Beatles before you could leave me. I rewrote history so that I was the misunderstood genius and you were the ambitious businessman. I turned you into the villain so I could be the victim. Paul felt tears running down his cheeks, tears of rage, of pain, but also of relief. Finally, after 11 years of confusion and hurt, he understood. The betrayal hadn't been about music or money or creative differences. It had been about fear, the primal fear of abandonment that had driven John to destroy the thing he loved most. And now what? Paul asked. What am I supposed to do with this? John sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall. He looked smaller, more fragile than Paul had ever seen him. The rock and roll rebel who had once declared the Beatles more popular than Jesus now seemed like nothing more than a broken man seeking absolution. I don't know, John admitted. I just know I couldn't keep living with this lie, even as a ghost. The confession hung between them like a bridge, fragile, but finally connecting two shores that had been separated for far too long. What happened next changed both of them forever. Paul sat on the floor next to John. For the next 4 hours, they talked about everything that had been left unsaid, about the beautiful moments they had shared, about the songs they had written together in tiny rooms in Liverpool, about the dreams they had pursued when they still believed they could conquer the world without losing their souls. They talked about the Cavern Club, where it all began, about the night they met, when Paul was just a left-handed kid with a guitar who knew how to tune it properly, about the first time they harmonized together and realized they had found something magical. Do you remember the first song we wrote together? John asked as the clock approached midnight. 1 after 9:09. Paul smiled for the first time since John had arrived. We were so proud of it. We thought we'd written the greatest rock and roll song ever. We were 15 years old, and we thought we knew everything. Maybe we did know everything then, Paul said quietly. Maybe we just forgot along the way. They talked about the madness of Beatlemania, the screaming crowds that made it impossible to hear themselves play, the hotel rooms where they'd hide from the world, writing songs on acoustic guitars while thousands of fans gathered in the streets below. I used to watch you during those concerts, John said, when the screaming was so loud that we couldn't hear the music anymore. You just keep playing, keep smiling, like you were performing for an audience of one. I envied that. I could never find joy in the chaos the way you did. I was terrified most of the time, Paul admitted, but you and George and Ringo were there. As long as we were together, I thought we could handle anything. They also talked about the pain, about the price they had paid for fame, about how pressure had turned 4 friends into 4 strangers competing for the world's attention, about the moment when making music stopped being fun and started being work. Do you remember when we wrote, I Want to Hold Your Hand? Paul asked near midnight. John smiled for the first time that night. At the piano in your house. Your dad brought us tea and told us it sounded like a hit. And you said you didn't care if it was a hit. You just wanted it to be honest. I was more honest then. John took off his glasses and cleaned them. Before everything became so complicated. Paul looked at his old friend. The lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the invisible scars from 11 years of guilt and remorse. But underneath all that damage, he could still see the young man who had once believed that love was all you need. John, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Shoot. Are you dying? Is that why you sought me out? Is that why you finally decided to tell the truth? John was silent for a long moment. Outside, New York had settled into its late-night rhythm. The traffic had thinned. The tourists had gone back to their hotels. Only the truly restless remained on the streets, and in that hotel room, two men confronted the weight of mortality. Then he nodded slowly. The doctors say I have cancer. Pancreatic. 6 months, maybe less. Paul closed his eyes. Even after everything that had happened, the idea of losing John again seemed unbearable. They had wasted so many years in anger and misunderstanding. The thought that they might only have months left was devastating. Does Sean know? No, Yoko does. She was the one who convinced me to find you. She said if I was going to really die this time, I needed to settle my pending accounts. Paul stood up and walked to the window. New York slept under a blanket of golden lights. The city that had brought them together, that had witnessed the most important conversation of their lives. Central Park spread out below like a dark ocean, punctuated by the lights of late-night joggers and dog walkers living their ordinary, beautiful lives. What do you need from me? Paul asked without turning around. Forgiveness, John whispered. Just that, forgiveness. Paul turned toward his old friend, who remained sitting on the floor, vulnerable and broken, but finally honest. For the first time in 11 years, John Lennon was telling the complete truth, and it had stripped away every defense he'd ever built. I already forgave you, John. I forgave you years ago. What I couldn't do was understand why you had done all that. Now that I understand, there's nothing left to forgive. John began to cry. Not the silent tears he had shed before, but deep sobs that came from the darkest place in his soul. Sobs for the friendship he had destroyed, for the years they had lost, for the fear that had driven him to hurt the person he loved most. Paul approached and for the first time in 11 years hugged John Lennon. In that room at the Plaza Hotel in New York, two old friends reconciled with their past and found peace in forgiveness. John Lennon died 6 months later at a private clinic in Bermuda. This time, his death was real. This time, Paul was there to say goodbye. The letter John had written was never made public. Paul kept it, along with the other relics of their friendship. Photographs from Liverpool, song lyrics written with 4 hands, memories from a time when they believed love was all they needed. But something extraordinary happened after the encounter in New York. Paul began talking differently about John in interviews. He stopped defending himself from past accusations and started talking about his old friend's real genius, about his vulnerability, his pain, his humanity. John was more fragile than anyone imagined, Paul told a Rolling Stone reporter in 1982. All that shell of toughness and sarcasm was his way of protecting himself. Underneath it all, he was just a kid who was afraid of being abandoned. The reporter had pressed for details about their reconciliation, sensing there was more to the story. But Paul had simply smiled and said, "Some things are too sacred to share with the world." George Harrison, who never knew about the encounter in New York, noticed the change in Paul immediately. It was like he had made peace with something, George told Ringo years later. Suddenly, he could talk about John without bitterness. It was like he had found a peace he had been searching for decades. Ringo noticed it too. Paul started including John in conversations again, not as my former bandmate or John Lennon of the Beatles, but as my friend John. It was like he was alive again, at least in Paul's heart. The truth about New York remained secret for 40 years, until now. The letter John wrote for Paul was found in 2021 among Linda McCartney's belongings, which she had apparently kept after Paul's death. An attached note, written by Paul, said, "This is the real story. Someday, when it no longer matters, someone should tell it." That day has come. In the Plaza Hotel archives in New York, there's a record of 2 British guests who stayed in suites 507 and 512 for 4 days in March 1981. The names on the register are John Winston and James McCartney. The hotel still has the receipts for room service meals that were never eaten, telephone calls that were never made, and a bill for damages to a Persian rug that was stained with tears. Hotel staff who worked that week remember seeing two older men walking together through Central Park, talking quietly, occasionally stopping to feed the ducks in the pond. One of the bellhops, now retired, recalls that they looked like old friends who had found each other after a long time apart. Nobody knew who they really were. Nobody knew they were witnessing the moment when two of the most important composers of the 20th century forgave each other and found the peace that had been eluding them for 11 years. The custodial staff at the plaza found something strange in Suite 512 after the guests checked out. Scattered on the floor were pieces of paper covered in musical notation, song fragments, melody lines, as if two old friends had tried one last time to write music together. Those pages were thrown away, lost forever. But the hotel's head of housekeeping, a woman named Maria Santos who had worked at the plaza for 30 years, remembered them clearly. It looked like they were trying to finish something they had started long ago, she said in a recent interview. Like a song that had been waiting 40 years to be completed. New York keeps many secrets. In its busy streets, in its elegant hotels, in its silent parks. But none as powerful as the secret of 4 days in March, when John Lennon asked for forgiveness and Paul McCartney gave it without conditions. The most famous friendship in music didn't end with insults and lawsuits. It ended with forgiveness, understanding, and the promise that no matter what the world believed, they knew the truth. And sometimes, knowing the truth is enough. But here's the question nobody has been able to answer. If Paul kept John's letter for 40 years, what other secrets did he keep? What other truths are waiting in some dusty archive, ready to change everything we think we know about rock and roll's greatest story? In the basement of the McCartney estate in Scotland, there are boxes of papers that have never been catalogued. Letters from John that arrived after his supposed death, recordings made in secret during the 1970s, song lyrics written in John's handwriting dated years after 1980. Maybe, just maybe, the New York story is only the beginning. The rest is still waiting to be discovered. And in a world where truth has become a luxury, maybe some secrets are worth keeping forever.